I'm now going to show you how you can create nighttime skies and basically turn the sun into the moon, although the image of the moon showing up in the sun doesn't typically work all that well. Even using the planets with an overlay, it's best taken care of in post. Although we can still get really good lighting set up along with clouds, and then it would take very minimal post to get the moon in there. There are ways to achieve that within View. Maybe we'll go ahead and take a look at some of those settings once we have the sky set up. So you can load in the Start Scene 1, which is basically just the default scene, but with ground plane, a little grass on it. And the first thing we want to do is, I'm just going to pitch up the camera, so we're just really looking at the atmosphere. And we want to turn this into nighttime. So what we can do is, first, I do need to find the sun, so I'm just going to rotate the camera around. We can grab the sun and switch the view mode and just kind of move that into place. And there are a couple of different ways we can do this. I'm going to show you one way I've found to work out pretty well. So if we go into the atmosphere editor, what I want to do is take the sky ground density and decrease the blue amount to a very dark blue. We can desaturate it a little. Bring that down. So we'll start with, for RGB, 6, 26, and 54. Next I want to modify the decay color. First I'll just bring down the density of the atmosphere. We won't have as much light going through. And I might need to darken that a little further. But let's go ahead and take a look at the decay color. I'm going to edit that. And what I want to create is more of a purple hue, something darker. And this is going to be the light near the horizon. So we'll go for something a little more purple. I'm going to reduce the haze and fog to rather low levels, 200 meters to 500 meter range. Also increase the decay amount. And go under glow and intensity, increase the glow a little of the scene. Increase that scattering amount for both the clouds and the overall scene. Now there's still a lot of lightness in the atmosphere. I'm going to just bring down the decay altitude and go over to the light tab. Most of the glow we're seeing in the lighter areas are primarily controlled by the ambient light color. So what we can do is take that ambient light color and make it a darker blue. And now we've kind of got a start of a night sky. I'm going to go over to the Sun tab and reduce the size of the sun to 1%. The corona we can increase or decrease really depending on how much atmospheric we want to have, whether or not we kind of want a halo. Otherwise we can reduce the value, make something much smaller, and then increase glow intensity in order to make that effect more obvious. So now let's go ahead and add a cloud layer. We could also turn on the stars. I'm going to turn off the lens flares. So in the Effects tab we can increase the number of stars, and I'll just use a kind of medium brightness. I'm going to add a little bit more to the scene. Maybe reduce the brightness a little further. We'll type in a value of 30. So going over to clouds, let's add in a layer. And we're going to go to the Spectral 2. And I'm going to start with the dark cumulus. I'm also going to go ahead, go to my options and preview clouds so that we can get an OpenGL preview of this along with being able to render it. If you're making a lot of modifications to the clouds over and over, it's a good idea to turn off the OpenGL display until you're pretty much finished, because otherwise it's going to be constantly refreshing, and it might take up a lot of system memory. So it's really going to depend on how much work you're going to be spending on the atmosphere. I just want to turn this on for now, and we can take a look. Go ahead and render this out. So what I really want to do is increase the intensity around the edges and have something with far less light around inside the primary shape. So what I'm going to do is first of all reduce the height of the cloud layer and increase the opacity amount. If we go to the ambient lighting, I'm going to reduce that to around 10%. And we can start to see it showing a little bit better. We have a lot of intensity in some areas of the cloud where we might not want them. So what I can do is go over to adjust the cloud scattering. We'll just make some modifications. So now it's more of a haze. If we need to get rid of that, some of these settings can be very touchy. So it's a good idea to not go too far with them without really doing a preview. Also, I think the sharpness is going to be beneficial for these clouds. So we'll increase the sharpness and also modify the volumetric color, make it a little bit darker. If you want, you can also add a little bit of color to it, maybe a little bit of blue. That can also help the appearance. And it's starting to look a little bit better. I'm going to reduce the density amount just a little and decrease the volumetric color, making it mostly darker. Maybe reduce that glow intensity. It might be a bit too much. I also need to modify the haze and fog colors to match the scene a little bit better. The haze is a little too bright at the moment. We can darken that up. If we also want to use similar or exact color as the ambient light setting, that can really boost the scene quality. If the haze amount you're getting, if we take a look after the auto exposure, a little bright, I'm going to turn off the natural film response, turn that down a little. You might want to increase the haze height. We can really see it showing in all the different colors behind the cloud. The overall brightness of the cloud layer, we can reduce that ambient lighting further if needed, and also going into the ambient light color, if you want to make that a little darker, or maybe make that more purple, we could get a pretty nice effect. So let's go back into the sky, fog, and haze, and I'm going to increase the haze height just a little bit higher. I'm not going to worry about fog just yet. So now we have something a little more purple, because I did modify that one color. It can be an interesting look if that's what you're going for, but I am going to go back to that light, and let's just make that going back into blue. We could also make the ambient light color more from what we would see shining from the moon. So kind of a bluer tone, and it can of course range. And I think I brought the haze up a little too much. I'm going to set a manual value, just typing in 300 meters. And it's really a matter of balancing the ambient light along with the haze. Because the decay and the other settings are pretty straightforward. So we can reduce the density of the sky, go to the ambient light, and make it almost black. And we're starting to get a little bit closer. If we want to tint the clouds, we can very easily just modify the volumetric color of them. And I'm going to increase the height of the cloud layer, or the altitude of the cloud layer. Raise it up into the sky a little bit further, so we have more of a full view. And overall, that doesn't look too bad. I do want to modify the light color. Now, we're going to have to choose whether to modify the exposure or the lighting of the scene, or both. We can go to the Light tab and reduce the light intensity to make it darker, and then modify the exposure and create a higher contrast. But right now I think the overall lightning with cloud edges shouldn't be as white as it is. So what we can do is go to the sunlight color and just add a hint of blue. And now, even the very small amounts of the blue are going to create a huge impact on the look of the entire scene. So you do want to be careful that you're not making it too intense. So with just a slight little hint, it's already looking a little better. If we want to increase that amount further, just bring down and increase the color amount. So that does look slightly better. At the moment this is really grainy. That's mainly the cloud itself and the setup for it. So we'll probably have to make some adjustments to smooth it around the edges. We can increase the detail amount, and then in the detail settings, reduce the roughness slightly, and then you can adjust how uniform you want them to be. There's also a custom cloud layer profile on this. So if we go to edit that, we can make some modifications to the filter to bring it up, add a little more variation, which should fill it in. I also want to increase the sharpness amount, which is going to really brighten up the edges. And then we can just modify glow intensity and some of the light scattering. If you need to increase the aerial perspective, we can do that as well, which will make a much more dense atmosphere and really will help with the subtraction more around the horizon. You can also reduce that too to make a much clearer looking sky. I've still got some issues here with the grain, which I may be able to very easily take care of just by reducing density, decreasing the height, increasing the cover. And I'm going to reduce the feathers, a slight adjustment to the detail amount, and get rid of the altitude variations altogether. So that's a pretty interesting night sky. I've gone ahead and prepared quite a few cloud variations and some different lighting examples that you can load in. So all of the night sky scenes that come with the training, go ahead and load them in, take a look at them. I do have quite a few setups for each of the clouds, and a couple of different variations in the overall lighting and the positioning of the sun. Mostly these are clear skies. If you load in the scene Night Sky 7, which is what I have a preview being rendered of right now, this is one of the other night skies I've set up. I want to show you what you can do with the aerial perspective. If we wanted to darken the horizon so it wasn't as bright all the way around, a really easy way would just be to increase the aerial perspective. So increasing the density of the atmosphere. And since most of these amounts are very minimal, at least the height of the haze and the fog, we don't need to worry about destroying too much of the lighting by using the aero perspective. I also want to note that the scene, we have a decay amount slightly higher than the sky mean altitude, which in this case ended up being a much better solution. So I'm going to increase the aerial perspective to 3, and we're going to see more of that fog and haze being subtracted from around the horizon. It also has a little more saturation from the color set to those values. If you wanted to have less of a clear sky, what you could do is go over to the effects, turn off the stars, because we really don't want to see those then if we're going to be covering pretty much everything up. Increase the cover amount to a fairly high amount. Now, setting it to 100% isn't going to completely cover the sky because of some of the other settings. But one thing I'm going to do is increase the uniform, decrease sharpness, and maybe increase the cover a little bit further. We can go into the function or modify the filter a little bit further, modify the cloud layer profile if you want to have more clouds in the scene, and fill it up a little bit more. We do need to subtract from the atmosphere a bit, so we would need to use either the fog or the haze. So depending on how your setup is, it might be easier to use one or the other. Let's go ahead and use the haze, set the altitude much higher to maybe go up to the height of the sky mean altitude. Increase the density, keeping in mind it is going to darken the scene. So now we have a little more even of light. This would even work as a really fairly interesting storm. With the modifications to the profile, there's a really nice inward subtraction before it starts to kind of go up to the top and spread out. And the flat bottoms look pretty good. I might have the color set a little too blue, so go ahead and reduce that. Yellow gives a fairly interesting look, depending on the type of sky you want to have. You could also remove pretty much all the color completely if you didn't want to have such a high saturation amount. If we wanted to fill this in a bit further, since the cover amount really isn't doing it, we would have to reduce the detail. And if not, go into the function itself and find out exactly what it is that's creating it, which is a basic repeater, so a fractal, and then we have an offset. So what we could actually do is just increase the offset to, let's go ahead and use 0.85, and then when we get the cover amount, it should help fill that in a lot more. Might need to edit the filter a little further, but you can definitely see the impact. So definitely another interesting type of sky. I'll go ahead and save this one out too, so you can load this in. And let's go ahead and use number 8. So you'll be able to load in Night Sky 8 as well. Now I was talking about the moon before, so let's go ahead and take the sunlight and move it up so that it is visible behind one of the clouds. If we go to the atmosphere editor and take a look at the sunlight, I do have the size of the sun set to 0, which is probably what we'd need in order to pull this off in view. So we're just going to look for where we can see the sunlight, and then I'm going to add in a planet. By default, it's set up to be set to the moon. Luna being Earth's moon. And what we can do is move this kind of over the sun, increase the brightness. The main problem is what you have to use to make it to be bright enough or dark enough compared to the way the auto exposure is set up. So if needed, you might have to load in your own image. But it looks like this is actually working out pretty well. I'll go ahead and let that finish rendering. So in that case, it doesn't look too bad. The only problem is it just really isn't bright enough for the way the clouds are currently set up. So we could increase the overall brightness of the scene, but even still it might not work correctly. So you may have to just bring in a higher contrast image of the moon. You can go to Custom, and then it'll give you the ability to just load in an image that you have. You can also adjust the scale of the planet, switching to the size gizmo. We can scale that up. So if we wanted to have a really large moon, and right now my gizmos are not showing, probably because my near plane or far plane distance is too small and not far enough. So here we go. We can now see that showing up properly. So we'll take the sunlight and switch to the move gizmo, stick that in the center, and then also go over to the atmosphere editor and increase the size of the corona, which will help lighten the moon or any planets, anything you have loaded in there. So it does look like we would actually need to decrease the brightness of the moon or the planet object in order to show up correctly now with increasing the size of the corona. Also, you can modify the light scattering, make it a little crisper around the clouds. I did end up turning off the natural film response because it was diffusing a little bit too much, and I want a little bit of a harsher cutoff where the moon would be showing. Now, if we have any reflected light from the ground that we want to show on the clouds, we can go over to the Cloud tab and increase the ambient lighting amount. This may not show up correctly, but it looks like it's working out okay. It's a little too bright. If you wanted to make a separate color for the ambient light, you can go into Atmosphere Editor, edit the material, and under Lighting and Effects, force the ambient light color to a color of your choice. Otherwise, I've got GI ambient lighting on. Also keep in mind that that setting, if it's on, is not affected by any of the lighting models. This is a completely separate type of GI lighting. And at the moment, it currently doesn't have a separate pass within the multipass. So I'm going to decrease the ambient light amount. We can go to the planet, decrease brightness, and I'm going to go ahead and render that out again. It does look like the glow intensity is pretty much canceling out the moon shape, or at least the definition. So in this case, it would be something that would probably be easier to render out a cloud mask and then just take care of it in post. So if we go to the render options, set this to final so we can open the multipass. And we have a cloud mask option, which is going to be the combination of all clouds. So if you do have separate layers and you want to have different masks for those layers, then you would need to turn them on individually and render them out. If you do need an all-in-one pass, I did create some training for matte painting and compositing, which is a portion of that training being cloud masks and creating a z-depth pass for clouds. And in that training you'll find how to break down all the cloud layers, light them, and modify them in order to create flat or shaded depth masks that you can use for compositing. Now we'll work with pretty much version 6.5 and up. And there's just one last thing I want to do with this, and basically just change the volumetric color to a very light amount, reduce the ambient lighting, increase density, increase height. I also want to note that the internal unit of this scene is different from the other scenes that we've been working on, which is 0.1 meters, which was the original default of View 8, and it is the default for View 7. So you'll find slightly different values between the scenes. But now we're going to see a much more intense light and a much more intense darkness. We increase the sharpness value to really bring out those edges if needed, and also we could go in and adjust how uniform it is, maybe a little more ambient lighting. For the most part, I think this scene is pretty much finished. I'm going to go ahead and just undo that setting. And then I'm going to save this out as Night Sky 8-2 so that you can load it in if you want to take a look at it.